The sound of gunfire echoes across the hills of Sierra Leone as 7-year-old Ibrahim clutches a bundle twice his size, his small feet struggling to keep pace with armed men whose faces have forgotten mercy. In the suffocating heat of 1997, childhood becomes a luxury this boy can no longer afford. His village, once alive with the laughter of children and the songs of women grinding cassava, now lies silent behind a curtain of smoke. The war has come for him as it has come for thousands of others, transforming innocent hands into instruments of survival. Ibrahim's story begins not with the rifle he will soon be forced to carry, but with the morning his grandmother braided his hair while humming ancient Tem lullabies. 3 days before the rebels arrived, he had been racing through red dirt paths with his cousins, their voices rising like birds above the green canopy of palm trees. His father worked the diamond mines, returning home each evening with stories and small treasures hidden in his pockets. His mother sold fish in the local market, her bright fabrics a splash of colour against the weathered wooden stalls. They were not wealthy, but they were whole. They were family. They were everything Ibrahim knew about love. The morning the armed group entered their village, Ibrahim was helping his mother prepare breakfast. The scent of palm oil and rice filled their small home when the first shots rang out. His mother's eyes went wide with a terror he had never seen before. She grabbed his hand and whispered words that would haunt him for decades to come. Run, and never look back. But there was nowhere to run. The rebels moved like shadows through the narrow paths, rounding up anyone who could carry a load or hold a weapon. Children were particularly valuable, their small frames perfect for navigating tight spaces, their minds still malleable enough to be shaped by fear and necessity. When rough hands seized Ibrahim from behind his mother's skirt, he looked back once to see her on her knees, tears streaming down her face as she reached for him. That image would burn in his memory through every dark night that followed. The rebels separated the children immediately, loading them into the back of a rusted truck that reeked of diesel fuel and desperation. Ibrahim found himself pressed against other children, some younger than him, their eyes already beginning to hold the hollow stare of those who have seen too much. The truck lurched forward, carrying them away from everything they had ever known toward a future none of them could imagine. The first camp Ibrahim arrived at existed in a twilight world between civilization and chaos. Here, children as young as 6 learned to strip and clean weapons before they could properly tie their shoes. The commanders, many of them barely teenagers themselves, ruled with a mixture of violence and twisted protection. Ibrahim quickly learned that survival meant becoming invisible when possible and indispensable when necessary. He carried ammunition, water, and supplies that weighed nearly as much as he did. His small shoulders bent under loads that would challenge grown men, while his mind struggled to process the daily horror surrounding him. At night, lying on the hard ground with only a thin blanket between him and the red earth, Ibrahim would close his eyes and try to remember his grandmother's voice. He would recite the multiplication tables his father had taught him, whisper the prayers his mother had made him memorize, anything to keep some small part of his former self alive. The other children around him had learned not to cry, not to speak of home, not to show weakness of any kind. But in the darkness, Ibrahim could hear their quiet sobs, the sound of childhoods being buried in silence. The rebels moved frequently, always staying ahead of government forces or rival groups. Ibrahim learned to read the signs of an impending move, the increased tension among the commanders, the hurried packing of supplies, the way the older fighters would clean their weapons with extra care. Each relocation meant walking for miles through dense forest, across rivers that ran red with mud, past villages that had been reduced to ash and memory. His feet, once protected by his father's carefully crafted sandals, became tough and scarred from months of walking on rocky terrain. Months blended into a nightmare of endless marching, broken sleep, and the constant fear that tomorrow might be his last day alive. Ibrahim watched other children disappear, some escaping into the forest never to be seen again, others simply fading away from exhaustion and despair. He learned to hoard small pieces of food, to find clean water in the most unlikely places, to read the moods of his captors and adjust his behavior accordingly. These were lessons no child should ever have to learn, survival skills carved into his consciousness through terror and necessity. The war raged around them with a brutality that defied comprehension. Ibrahim witnessed acts of violence that would take years of therapy to process, scenes of destruction that painted themselves permanently across his young mind. Yet somehow, in the deepest part of his consciousness, a small flame continued to flicker. Perhaps it was his father's voice telling him that diamonds are formed under pressure, or his mother's gentle hands showing him how to tend wounds with whatever materials were available. Whatever it was, it refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest moments of his captivity. As 1998 dawned, Ibrahim had grown taller, but thinner, his child's face bearing expressions no 7-year-old should possess. He had learned to move like a ghost through the forest, to anticipate danger before it arrived, to endure physical and emotional pain that would break many adults. But he had also learned something else, something that would prove far more valuable in the years to come. He had learned that even in hell, there are choices to be made, small acts of kindness to be shared, tiny rebellions against despair that keep hope alive. When other children were hurt, Ibrahim would share his meager rations. When the younger ones cried for their mothers, he would tell them stories his grandmother had told him. These small acts of humanity, performed in the shadow of inhumanity, began to shape the man he would one day become. The sounds of distant artillery fire that morning carried a different quality, a rhythm that even the commanders seemed to recognize. Government forces were closing in, and for the first time in months, Ibrahim allowed himself to imagine that this nightmare might have an end. He didn't dare hope for rescue. Hope had become too dangerous a luxury, but he began to prepare himself for change. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of the West African forest, casting long shadows across a makeshift camp where the sound of boots echoed against packed earth. 10-year-old Ibrahim crouched behind a fallen log, his small hands trembling as they gripped a weapon too heavy for his frame. 3 years had passed since armed men had torn him from his village. 3 years since he had last seen his mother's face or heard his father's voice calling his name across their small compound. The boy who once chased chickens in his grandmother's yard had been shaped into something else entirely. His childhood compressed into a series of commands, marches, and survival instincts that had replaced the songs and stories of his early years. But on this particular morning in the year 2000, the familiar rhythm of camp life would shatter forever. The distant rumble of vehicles approached through the forest, growing louder with each passing moment. These were not the battered trucks of his captors, but the white United Nations vehicles that would carry the promise of liberation. Ibrahim had heard whispers among the older fighters about peacekeepers, about negotiations, about the possibility of release. But hope had become a luxury he could no longer afford to entertain. When the first UN peacekeeper emerged from the trees, his blue helmet catching the dappled sunlight, Ibrahim felt something stir within him that he had almost forgotten existed. The tall man approached slowly, his hands visible, his voice calm and measured as he spoke in Creole, the language that connected all the children of Sierra Leone. The peacekeeper's eyes held none of the hardness that Ibrahim had grown accustomed to seeing in adult faces. Instead, there was something else, something that resembled the gentleness he dimly remembered from before the war consumed his world. The process of liberation unfolded with surprising swiftness. Documents were signed, names were recorded, and suddenly Ibrahim found himself among a group of other children, all bearing the same hollow expressions, all carrying invisible weights that seemed too heavy for their young shoulders. The journey to the refugee camp in neighboring Guinea stretched across 2 days of dusty roads and uncertain silences, each mile carrying them further from the only life Ibrahim could clearly remember, and toward an unknown future that felt both terrifying and impossibly distant. When the truck finally stopped at the entrance to the refugee camp, Ibrahim stepped down onto foreign soil with legs that had grown unsteady from the long journey. The camp stretched before him like a small city constructed from canvas and corrugated metal, a temporary home that housed thousands of people who, like him, had been displaced by the violence that had torn through their homeland. The air carried the mingled sense of cooking fires, dust, and humanity pressed close together, while voices speaking dozens of languages created a constant, background hum of survival and resilience. The aid workers who greeted the newly arrived children moved with practiced efficiency, born from years of receiving young refugees whose stories were written in their eyes long before they could find words to speak them aloud. Ibrahim was assigned to a section of the camp designated for unaccompanied minors, where rows of small tents provided shelter and a semblance of privacy in a world where both had become precious commodities. His first meal in the camp consisted of rice and beans served from large metal pots, the simple flavors triggering memories of his mother's cooking that brought tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 3 years. Sleep came fitfully that first night, interrupted by dreams that blended the sounds of gunfire with his grandmother's lullabies, creating a chaotic symphony that reflected the confusion in his young mind. But when morning light filtered through the tent fabric, Ibrahim discovered something remarkable. For the first time in 3 years, he had awakened without someone shouting commands at him, without the immediate pressure to move, to march, to prepare for another day of conflict. The silence felt almost overwhelming in its gentleness. The days that followed introduced Ibrahim to a routine built around healing rather than survival. Medical workers examined his malnourished frame with gentle hands, treating infections and injuries with patience and care. Counselors sat with him in quiet circles, using art and play to help him process experiences that had no adequate words. Slowly, tentatively, Ibrahim began to remember pieces of the boy he had been before the war changed everything. Fragments of curiosity and wonder that had somehow survived the harshest of circumstances. It was in the camp school, constructed from wooden poles and plastic sheeting, where Ibrahim first glimpsed the possibility of a different future. The teacher, a refugee herself from the capital city of Freetown, possessed an extraordinary gift for awakening intellectual hunger in children who had known only physical hunger for too long. When she placed a worn textbook in Ibrahim's hands and began teaching him about the human body, about how hearts pumped blood and brains controlled thought, something ignited within him that would prove to be unextinguishable. Within weeks, Ibrahim's remarkable intelligence became apparent to everyone around him. He devoured every book the camp library contained, asked questions that demonstrated not just curiosity, but genuine analytical thinking, and showed an intuitive understanding of complex concepts that impressed even the most experienced aid workers. His hunger for knowledge seemed to grow stronger with each lesson, each new piece of information becoming a building block in the reconstruction of his identity and his dreams for what life might hold beyond the boundaries of the refugee camp. 15 is an age when most teenagers worry about homework and friendships, but Ibrahim's hands still trembled when unexpected sounds broke the silence. The refugee camp had become home for 3 years now, but the echoes of his past remained as vivid as yesterday. In the morning light, filtering through the camp's makeshift streets, he walked with purpose toward a destination that would reshape everything he thought possible about his future. The clinic sat at the edge of the camp, like a beacon of hope, wrapped in white canvas and determination. Ibrahim had volunteered here for months, sweeping floors, organizing supplies, translating for patients who spoke only local dialects. The work gave him something precious that the violence had stolen, a sense of usefulness that didn't involve destruction. But on this particular morning, as he pushed through the entrance flaps, he encountered something that would ignite a passion he never knew existed within him. Dr. Sarah Martinez moved through the clinic with the focused grace of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to surrender to despair. The visiting humanitarian doctor from Doctors Without Borders carried herself with a quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. Ibrahim watched from across the room as she knelt beside a young man whose head was wrapped in bloodied bandages, a recent victim of artillery fire that had exploded near the camp's perimeter. Her hands moved with surgical precision, but her voice carried the warmth of genuine care. What captivated Ibrahim wasn't just her skill, it was the way she spoke to the patient about his brain injury, explaining in simple terms how the trauma had affected his memory and coordination. She described the intricate pathways of the human mind with the wonder of someone who still marveled at its complexity, even after years of medical practice. Ibrahim found himself stepping closer, drawn by words he barely understood but felt compelled to learn. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each one capable of forming thousands of connections with other cells. Dr. Sarah's explanation painted pictures in Ibrahim's mind of electrical storms and chemical conversations happening inside every person's skull. For someone who had witnessed the devastating effects of head injuries throughout the conflict, this glimpse into the brain's remarkable ability to heal and adapt felt like discovering a hidden universe of possibility. Day after day, Ibrahim positioned himself near Dr. Sarah's work area, absorbing every word, every technique, every moment of teaching she offered to local staff. He began staying after his regular duties ended, organizing her medical supplies and preparing treatment areas before she arrived each morning. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. Dr. Sarah began explaining procedures to him directly, testing his memory of anatomical terms, sharing stories of neurosurgical cases she had encountered in conflict zones around the world. The transformation in Ibrahim's countenance was visible to everyone in the camp. The haunted expression that had shadowed his features for years began giving way to something resembling hope mixed with intellectual hunger. He started collecting discarded medical journals that humanitarian workers left behind, studying diagrams he couldn't fully comprehend, but feeling drawn to nonetheless. His tent became a miniature library of medical texts written in English, a language he was teaching himself with single-minded determination. Dr. Sarah recognized something exceptional in Ibrahim's curiosity and dedication. She began bringing him books specifically chosen for his growing interest in neuroscience, starting with basic anatomy texts and progressing to more complex materials about brain trauma and surgical intervention. She spent her evening hours teaching him medical terminology, explaining the principles of sterile procedure, and sharing the philosophical foundations that had drawn her to medicine in the first place. The young man, who once carried weapons designed to destroy life, now found himself fascinated by the intricate mechanisms that sustained it. Ibrahim learned about the brain's plasticity, its remarkable ability to rewire itself after injury, forming new pathways around damaged areas. This knowledge felt personal and profound, as if he was discovering not just scientific facts, but a roadmap for his own psychological healing. Every neuron's capacity for regeneration seemed to mirror his own potential for transformation. His academic performance in the camp's educational programs had always been strong, but now Ibrahim approached his studies with laser-focused intensity. Mathematics became the language for understanding statistical analysis in medical research. English literature helped him develop the communication skills essential for patient care. Science courses transformed from abstract concepts into the building blocks for understanding human physiology and pathology. The camp's education coordinator, Mr. Hassan, began taking special notice of Ibrahim's exceptional grades and obvious academic potential. Conversations between Dr. Sarah and Mr. Hassan revealed an extraordinary opportunity, a scholarship program specifically designed for refugee students with demonstrated excellence and clear career goals. The application process was rigorous, requiring not just outstanding academic performance, but also essays demonstrating how the student planned to use their education to benefit their community and the broader world. Ibrahim worked on his scholarship application with the same intensity he had once applied to survival. His personal essay described his journey from child soldier to aspiring physician, but more importantly, it outlined his vision for returning to Sierra Leone as a neurosurgeon specializing in trauma cases. He wrote about the thousands of war survivors living with brain injuries, many of whom had never received proper medical evaluation or treatment. His dream was ambitious beyond measure, but it was grounded in lived experience and genuine compassion. The months of waiting for scholarship results tested Ibrahim's patience like nothing had since his liberation from the militia. Dr. Sarah had returned to her home country, but she maintained correspondence with him, continuing to send medical texts and encouragement. Her letters described the American medical education system, the years of undergraduate study followed by medical school and residency training. The path she outlined seemed impossibly long and challenging, but Ibrahim felt ready for whatever sacrifices it might require. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, Ibrahim held it with hands that no longer shook from trauma, but from excitement and overwhelming gratitude. The scholarship would cover his undergraduate education at a respected American university, with the possibility of additional support for medical school based on his academic performance. At 17, he would leave the refugee camp not as a displaced person seeking safety, but as a student pursuing a dream that had taken root in the most unlikely circumstances. The night before his departure, Ibrahim walked through the camp one final time, visiting the clinic where his transformation had begun. He thought about the 7-year-old boy who had first picked up a weapon, and the 15-year-old who had discovered his calling while watching Dr. Sarah treat patients with brain injuries. The journey from child soldier to aspiring neurosurgeon seemed impossible from the outside, but Ibrahim understood that the most profound changes often happen gradually, one choice at a time, one day of dedication building upon another until the impossible becomes inevitable. The fluorescent lights of Boston Logan International Airport cast an unfamiliar glow across Ibrahim's weathered hands as he clutched a single duffel bag containing everything he owned. At 18, his eyes held depths that belonged to someone decades older, carved by experiences no textbook could describe. The scholarship letter in his jacket pocket felt both weightless and impossibly heavy as he stepped into a world where snow existed outside of photographs and buildings reached toward clouds he had only dreamed of touching. The transition from refugee camp to American university campus represented more than geographical distance. Ibrahim's first weeks at Boston University unfolded like a series of cultural earthquakes, each day presenting obstacles that his survival instincts from Sierra Leone had not prepared him for. While his classmates complained about dining hall food, Ibrahim marveled at the abundance, remembering months when a single meal represented fortune. The abundance overwhelmed him initially, but what proved more challenging were the invisible barriers of language, social codes, and academic expectations that assumed a foundation of privilege he had never possessed. His dormitory roommate, a pre-med student from Connecticut, represented everything Ibrahim was not. Where Ibrahim carefully rationed every resource, his roommate discarded textbooks after single semesters. Where Ibrahim studied with the intensity of someone who understood education as salvation, his roommate approached assignments with casual confidence born from generational security. The contrast was not bitter but illuminating, revealing the vast distances that existed beyond mere geography. The nightmares arrived with predictable regularity. Post-traumatic stress transformed his sleep into a battlefield, where the sounds of Boston traffic became echoes of distant conflict. Ibrahim would wake in cold sweats, his heart racing as fragments of his childhood, as a soldier invaded his present reality as a student. These episodes threatened to derail his academic performance, but instead of seeking counseling services, he feared might compromise his scholarship status. Ibrahim channeled his sleepless hours into study sessions that stretched until dawn, painted his dormitory window with morning light. His academic performance became legendary among professors who had never encountered such relentless dedication. While other students balanced social activities with coursework, Ibrahim approached every assignment as if his life depended on perfect execution, because in many ways it did. His perfect attendance record remained unblemished through Boston winters that numbed his Sierra Leone bones, through illness that would have excused absences, through moments when the weight of transformation threatened to crush his resolve. The night shift job at the university hospital began as financial necessity, but evolved into educational opportunity. While mopping floors and emptying wastebaskets, Ibrahim observed the rhythms of medical care, the quiet intensity of doctors making life-altering decisions, the delicate choreography of nurses managing multiple crises simultaneously. These observations became informal medical education, supplementing his classroom learning with real-world context that textbooks could never provide. His pre-med requirements demanded perfection in organic chemistry, physics, and biology, subjects that required not just memorization, but conceptual mastery. Ibrahim approached each discipline with the methodical precision of someone who understood that second chances were luxuries he could not afford. His study groups became legendary among classmates who marveled at his ability to explain complex molecular interactions while simultaneously maintaining composure that spoke to experiences far beyond their own. The personal statement for medical school applications represented months of agonizing revision. How could he translate experiences as a child soldier into compelling narrative for admissions committees who had never encountered such raw testimony? Ibrahim wrote about his desire to heal brain trauma victims like those he had witnessed in Sierra Leone, about understanding the fragility of human consciousness in ways that traditional pre-med students could never comprehend. His essay described watching friends suffer traumatic brain injuries during conflict, of promising himself that if he ever possessed the skills to heal such wounds, he would dedicate his life to that purpose. The acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine arrived on a Tuesday morning when Boston snow covered his dormitory window like blank possibility. Ibrahim read the letter 3 times before the reality penetrated his disbelief. The full scholarship offer represented validation not just of his academic achievements, but of his fundamental belief that education could transform any circumstances, no matter how desperate or unlikely. Medical school at Johns Hopkins introduced new levels of academic intensity that even Ibrahim's legendary work ethic struggled to match initially. The volume of information required mastery that transcended memorization, demanding integration of complex systems, thinking that challenged every student regardless of background. Ibrahim's classmates included children of physicians, children of professors, children whose paths to medicine had been illuminated by generational privilege and expectation. Among them, Ibrahim stood out not for his background, but for his unwavering focus and his unique perspective on the value of human life. His neurosurgery residency application process required choosing between multiple prestigious programs, a luxury of options that felt surreal given his origins. Ibrahim selected the program that offered the most comprehensive training in trauma neurosurgery, knowing that his ultimate goal remained healing the kinds of injuries he had witnessed during his childhood in Sierra Leone. The residency would demand 7 years of 18-hour days, of making life and death decisions under pressure that would test every aspect of his character and competence. The transformation from refugee camp to neurosurgical residency represented more than personal achievement. Ibrahim's success embodied proof that human potential exists independent of circumstances, that education combined with determination can overcome barriers that seem insurmountable. His journey from holding weapons as a child to holding surgical instruments as a healer demonstrated the possibility of transformation that exists within every individual, regardless of their starting point. As Ibrahim prepared for his first day of neurosurgical training, the weight of his journey settled into quiet determination. The boy who had survived civil war, refugee displacement, cultural transition, and academic challenges now stood ready to fulfill the promise he had made to himself years earlier. His hands, once forced to hold instruments of destruction, would now wield tools of healing with precision and purpose that honored every step of his impossible journey from Sierra Leone to the most prestigious medical institutions in America. The fluorescent lights of Boston General Hospital cast their familiar glow across the neurosurgery wing as Dr. Ibrahim Kamara adjusts his surgical loops one final time. In 30 minutes, he will begin a delicate procedure to remove shrapnel fragments from the brain of a young man barely older than he was when his own world exploded into chaos. The irony is not lost on him. The same hands that once trembled around the weight of an AK-47 now steady themselves to repair the damage that violence leaves behind. At 35, Ibrahim has become one of the most respected neurosurgeons on the East Coast, specializing in traumatic brain injuries. His colleagues know him as the surgeon who never loses his composure who can work 16-hour days without complaint, who speaks to patients in 5 different languages depending on where their pain originated. What they don't know is that every incision he makes, every life he saves, every moment of hope he restores to a shattered family is his way of writing a different ending to a story that began in the diamond fields and rebel camps of Sierra Leone. The morning ritual is always the same. Ibrahim arrives at the hospital before dawn, reviews his cases in the quiet sanctuary of his office, and allows himself 5 minutes to remember, 5 minutes to honor the boy he once was, the friends who didn't make it out, and the impossible journey that brought him here. On his desk sits a small wooden carving of a palm tree, carved by his father's hands in their village before the world went mad. It reminds him that healing is always possible, even when the wounds run deeper than any scalpel can reach. Today's patient is Marcus, a 22-year-old veteran who stepped on an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. The metal fragments lodged in his brain have caused seizures, memory loss, and the kind of nightmares that Ibrahim understands all too well. As he studies the brain scans, Ibrahim sees not just the medical challenge, but the human story beneath it. He sees a young man whose dreams were interrupted by violence, whose future hangs in the balance of precision and hope. The surgical suite fills with the quiet energy of a team that has learned to trust their leader completely. Ibrahim's hands move with the confidence of someone who has stared death in the face and chosen life again and again. Each microsurgical movement is guided not just by years of training, but by the profound understanding that this work is sacred. He is undoing violence, piece by piece, one patient at a time. The operation lasts 7 hours. Fragment by fragment, Ibrahim extracts the metal that has imprisoned Marcus's mind. His hands never shake, his focus never wavers. This is what he was born to do, though it took him 28 years to discover it. When the last piece of shrapnel is removed and the brain tissue shows signs of healthy response, Ibrahim allows himself a moment of quiet celebration. Another life pulled back from the brink. Another small victory over the forces that once seemed insurmountable. But Ibrahim's work extends far beyond the sterile walls of Boston General. 3 times a year, he returns to West Africa, carrying surgical instruments and knowledge back to the places where his own healing began. In Freetown, Monrovia, and Accra, he operates in conditions that would challenge most Western surgeons. Flickering electricity, limited supplies, and hospitals that struggle with the most basic resources. Yet here, in these humble operating theatres, Ibrahim feels closest to his purpose. The medical missions are more than professional obligation. They are pilgrimage, penance, and promise all woven together. When he operates on a child soldier whose skull was fractured by a rifle butt, he sees his own reflection. When he teaches local surgeons advanced techniques for treating brain trauma, he passes on more than medical knowledge. He shares the conviction that healing is possible, that skills can be learned, that one person's transformation can ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. Dr. Amara, a young surgeon in Freetown who has become Ibrahim's protégé, often asks about his mentor's past. Ibrahim shares carefully, revealing enough to inspire without overwhelming. He talks about the refugee camp where he first learned English, the scholarship that seemed too good to be true, the nights when he questioned whether someone like him belonged in medical school. He speaks of the professors who saw potential where others might have seen only problems, and the patients who trusted him when he was still learning to trust himself. The stories serve a purpose beyond personal healing. Each time Ibrahim speaks about his journey, he plants seeds of possibility in the minds of young people who might otherwise see no path forward. In the children's ward of Connaught Hospital, where he volunteers during his missions, he meets young patients whose eyes hold the same mixture of fear and resilience he once knew. He tells them that pain can become purpose, that broken things can be made stronger, that the worst chapters of their lives don't have to define the entire story. His surgical precision has earned him recognition throughout the medical community. Research papers published in prestigious journals, speaking engagements at international conferences, awards that acknowledge both his clinical excellence and humanitarian work. But the accolades that matter most come in different forms. A letter from Marcus, the veteran whose brain he repaired, describing his return to college. A photograph from Dr. Amara showing her first successful independent brain surgery. A message from a former child soldier who is now studying medicine, inspired by Ibrahim's example. The financial success has allowed Ibrahim to establish the Kamara Foundation, which provides medical scholarships for young people from conflict zones. The foundation operates on a simple principle: that trauma can be transformed into healing, that those who have suffered most deeply often develop the greatest capacity for compassion. The scholarship recipients are selected not just for academic potential, but for their demonstrated resilience, their commitment to serving others, and their understanding that education is not a privilege, but a responsibility. Every evening, as Ibrahim drives home through the streets of Boston, he reflects on the impossible mathematics of his life. How does a child soldier become a brain surgeon? How does someone who was trained to destroy learn to create and heal? The answers are found not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small choices, daily disciplines, and the persistent belief that tomorrow can be different from yesterday. His apartment in Cambridge is decorated with artifacts from both worlds he inhabits. Diplomas from Harvard Medical School hang alongside traditional kente cloth from Ghana. Photographs of surgical teams share wall space with images of the refugee camp where his transformation began. Medical journals sit next to books of African poetry. The space reflects a man who has learned to hold multiple identities without losing sight of his core truth. He is a healer who happens to have survived war, not a former soldier who happens to practice medicine. The distinction matters because it shapes how he approaches every aspect of his work. When he counsels young surgeons struggling with the pressures of medical training, he reminds them that difficulty is not failure, that struggle builds strength, that the ability to endure hardship is itself a form of skill. When he advocates for increased funding for trauma research, he speaks with the authority of someone who understands violence from both sides of the operating table. His expertise in traumatic brain injury has made him a sought-after consultant for military hospitals, international aid organizations, and medical missions around the world. Each case teaches him something new about the resilience of the human spirit and the remarkable capacity of the brain to heal when given the right conditions. He has seen patients recover from injuries that should have been fatal, witnessed the slow miracle of neural pathways rebuilding themselves, observed the power of hope to accelerate healing in ways that medicine is still struggling to understand. The work is demanding, physically and emotionally. 16-hour surgeries, emergency calls at 3 a.m, the weight of making life and death decisions multiple times each week. But Ibrahim has learned to find strength in the very challenges that might overwhelm others. His past has given him an unusual tolerance for stress, an ability to remain calm in crisis, and a deep appreciation for the preciousness of every moment of peace. As he prepares for sleep each night, Ibrahim performs a ritual of gratitude that has sustained him through the darkest periods of his life. He gives thanks for the steady hands that allow him to operate, for the knowledge that enables him to heal, for the opportunities that brought him from a child soldier's desperation to a surgeon's purpose. He remembers the people who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, the patients who trusted him with their lives, the young people who now follow the path he helped to create. The boy who once held a rifle in fear now holds a scalpel in hope. The transformation is complete, but the work continues. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to heal, new chances to prove that no beginning has to determine the ending. In the operating room, in the refugee camps, in the lecture halls where he teaches the next generation of healers, Ibrahim Kamara continues to write a story of redemption that began in the worst place imaginable and has no limits on where it might lead. This is what victory looks like, not the absence of scars, but the transformation of wounds into wisdom, of trauma into triumph, of a child's forced violence into an adult's chosen healing. Every life saved, every student inspired, every surgical technique perfected, adds another chapter to a story that proves the most powerful force in the world is not destruction, but the human capacity to rise, to heal, and